I want to thank the three of you for fabulous talks, which, for me at least, stimulated a lot of neural activity. And I'd like to ask, to begin with, we started out in Jeff's talk at the nano level of looking at individual neurons and small networks of them, and then jumped to the macro level of marble-sized bits of brain tissue. And Andreas, you took us a little ways toward the middle, working from the bottom up. And these two traditions have long history. I mean, you know, neurons have been known for, their anatomy has been studied quite well for well over a century. And areas of the brain, long before fMRI came along, we had studies in stroke patients and so on that identified functional regions. But we've not made much progress on closing the gap between those two things. So I'm curious how you see that happening, if you see it happening, what needs to happen to be able to bridge that chasm.
I'll just take a whack at that. I'm probably the least equipped too, but what the hell. I mean, it's hard and it's important. But one avenue that may come along and become more fruitful is that so let me translate that into my version of that question. I would love to know whether the functional regions that I look at that are so distinct from each other functionally have any physical or cellular difference between them. Or if, you know, cortex is just cortex, right? And then it's like, you know, details of the wiring that make up the different functions. And of course, you know, Andreas showed the Brodmann map from 100 years ago, where he sliced up postmortem brains and looked at the details of the histology and argued based on just the appearance of the tissue, just the, you know, anatomy, that there were, you know, the cortex isn't just cortex, there are all these subdivisions you can make. The weird thing is that we don't really know whether those kind of cellular histological differences that Brodmann talked about map onto the functional differences of the kind that I talk about. And a big part of the problem is the individual variability that I talked about, right? If we didn't have that individual variability, we could just align a postmortem brain and an in vivo functional MRI brain and ask how well those things match. But given the substantial variation between individuals, we can't just directly take those data sets and put them together and ask if they correspond. But you know, there will eventually be solutions to that, and then we'll have not just the Brodmann map, we'll have all your kind of data, we'll have these exciting new atlases from the Allen Brain Institute that are looking at gene expression across the whole human brain. Some of this stuff just published a few months ago. And so I think eventually those things will come together, at least in the version of that question that asks, are there, you know, cellular, genetic, molecular differences between the kind of functional regions I identified. That's just one piece of it.
Both of you used the word modular in describing things with very different meanings. But that word suggests a kind of architecture, I mean, in particular, the idea that there are repetitive structures. I know about the columns. I gather you think that there are somewhat larger scale repetitive modules as well. Can you see a way to connect that kind of architecture to the high level functions that?
Yeah, so I do, and I think the way I see this, maybe I went through it too fast, but if you look at these networks, these deep convolutional networks that do, let's say, face recognition, they don't necessarily have a modular structure in the sense that each layer or each brain region, their brain region, has physical boundaries between them. But if you look at any point, if you point anywhere in the network at this location, they do something local. You know, they do a local thing. For example, max pooling is local. They will not look at the whole area. You know, they will not, the way they build their receptive field is local. They only care about a small chunk, and each one sort of does it independently. Now, it's like more of like a convolution instead of being, you know, have like a step function that is replicated. But it's local, and I think that is the key point here. So given that these things do something local and they do remarkable things that made Google and Facebook put billions of dollars in them, and it's on our iPhones and stuff, and we would call them some level of intelligence, right? I think there's a good chance that the brain is using the same principle. We just don't know what this local computation is, but that's the argument to study the local circuit. Now, it's not going to be exactly the same everywhere. In the frontal lobe, I'm sure it's going to be, there are many different cell types there. We already know that, including in humans, I
mean, the convolutional model looks a whole lot like the primary visual cortex, but there are lots of other things happening in the brain that I have a harder time imagining, I have a harder time mapping onto that model. I mean, like, childhood memories, local computation based on, orientation sensors doesn't take me very far down that path.
Yeah, so these other brain regions, I was kind of purposely focused on the neocortex. Now other brain regions like subcortical structures, even in other species like birds, for example, may have a different architecture to do similar computations. But you're right, like that doesn't necessarily mean that, for example, the nucleus basalis or the subcortical structures that have cholinergic inputs to the brain, and those we know they're not local. For example, when we're doing experiments like that, if you look at the noradrenergic input to the neocortex, these axons can go through a whole region and go to another region. So they're very different organizational principles maybe for the way other brain regions, maybe including the hippocampus, I don't know about the hippocampus, but the neocortex, which is the main emphasis at least of our studies right now, does seem to have this property.
If we know enough about the anatomy, I mean, if we get that cubic millimeter and find all the synapses and can map exactly what cell is talking to what other cell, and if we can even imagine going further and being able to trace actual signals through there, what are the prospects for actually understanding on the basis of that data what a thought is?
0.
Thank you.
And I think, being a bottom-up scientist where our efforts are trying very hard not to impose an expectation, but just look. The biggest enemy for these large ideas of understanding is information in exactly the wrong way. The more you know, the more information you have, the harder, not the easier it is, to generate an idea that explains this. And
you're the one who's producing all of this information.
That's correct. And one of the
Thanks
purposes.
a lot.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. But I think this is, the human genome is complete. We now have many examples of it. No one anymore says that they're trying to understand the human genome. It's not understandable. It is data, it can be mined, it has many important things to tell us, but a conceptual framework that you can hold in your head is not going to come from genomics, and I do not believe it's going to come from connectomics. We took what we thought was the simplest part of the brain, the thalamus. I mean, you could not ask for an easier place to see pure streams of information, and every expectation was defeated by the reality of the wiring, which is far more arbitrary, not random, arbitrary, where even cell types, the fundamental idea that some cells look different from others and therefore they should have different connectivity, we could not confirm that that was the case. We found very specific connectivities, but it was independent of the shapes of cells. What can I say? This is the way it looks. Now, maybe the cortex will be a lot different, but I'm worried.
And another instructive example that many people have brought up in the past is the C. elegans, right? The little nematode who has 302? I forget how many neurons.
302.
302 neurons, and they've mapped out all of them. You can ablate a single neuron and study behavior. They know the connectivity. They know everything about that nervous system, but they don't really know how C. elegans' nervous system works. So,
I think just one little comment here. Yeah, so knowing the connectivity itself will not tell us how something works, right? But at least the idea behind this Microns project is that the same data will know their connectivity. We will know what these neurons were doing in a specific computation in the mouse. So the wiring diagram, it's sort of like extra information to use to infer what the function is. And we've known that, people in the last even 5 years using some of these imaging methods have discovered a lot of things about functional organizational principles, at least. Maybe not like a deep sort of like equation you can write on the board. But the other thing is that I think, at least in my opinion, when you try and, if you find something that looks random and there's no principle, there must be an underlying principle that gave rise to that. For example, plasticity experience. Maybe if you grow the mouse in exactly the same environment, you do a controlled experiment, you'll have the same wiring. So at the end of the day, I think the quest for science is to, come with principles that can explain things. And now it may be very hard and it may not happen in our lifetime, but at least that is the goal.
You brought up the genetic code a moment ago, and 100 years ago, we had no idea even what the molecule that stores genetic information is. And at the time, we knew a whole lot about neurons and a fair amount about brains. And now, although you're right, of course, that we don't understand the genome, we nonetheless can do a whole lot with it. You can, read from a drop of blood what the sequence is. If neuroscience had progressed in the same way, presumably we could now read out your memories from your brain and edit them and combine different organisms to produce some sort of chimera. And we're obviously, for better or worse, nowhere near that. So it's not for lack of effort. I mean, there have been lots of brain projects in recent decades, and it's not for lack of talent. It's clearly a hard problem, but what's taking you so long?
No. I mean, we have completed actually 3 billionths of a mouse brain already, so don't criticize me. We're on our way. We're on our way. I think that there is a central dogma, although there's now lots of exceptions to that central dogma for DNA, and this is the way biology works. These principles that are so powerful in our textbooks, you can always find interesting exceptions, and eventually those exceptions get so heavy, the paradigm has to shift. But central dogma in DNA to RNA to protein has served us well as human beings. For me, there is a central dogma in neuroscience that has not been figured out yet, which is how does information from the outside get transformed in a form that's stably maintained in a brain and then spit out again as a behavior. There is a way, a mapping function somehow, that the world's experiences get instantiated into our networks, and then somehow we can recall a memory or memorize a piano piece and then spit it out at will. That's a deep mystery, and the answer to that is this kind of study. The answer will eventually come about, but I doubt it's going to be a satisfying answer in the sense that you can hold in your head that answer. It will be something, but it will be much more complicated than our thinking. I think that's my fundamental thought here is that human brains, as complicated as they are, what we use them for, thinking, is far more primitive than the machinery that allows us to do that thinking. And where I could say to you, do you think your dog will ever understand how his brain works? You say, well, of course not. It's a dog, after all. Our brain is only a little bigger than a dog's brain. So I'm not so convinced that somehow we have infinite intelligence and that everything is explainable. There are mysteries in the world that may just always be mysteries.
So for right now, I think it would certainly be illuminating for me to have some sense of just how deep our ignorance is. I mean, you say we don't have the central dogma yet. I'm aware that there's not consensus exactly, but there are well-regarded theories about how information is stored, about memory, or about learning mechanisms, the Hebbian idea of use it or lose it, and so on. Do we really, I mean, do we have confidence that we have, even at the basic question of, you know, engrammatization, I think was the word used, do we have the mechanism of that? Do we know how it happens?
We have theories,
Yeah.
but usually, in my view, most biology advances come from inconvenient truths. You find something that's not actually a theory, it's a fact, and you have to then conform to that. It's sort of hypothesis generating data that builds the theories of the future. We always had theories about how we learned. From Descartes on, you know, there's always been theories. There always will be theories, but I'm not sure we're any closer to, frankly, I mean, in principle, we're closer than a hydraulic theory of the brain, but, you know, I think there's still a ways to go. And that's why I think it's so powerful. And I really appreciated what you said, that no matter how much top-down thinking you do, when you force the system to conform to random things, you're going to learn things that you didn't want to learn, and yet you've got to deal with that. And that's what really moves the needle, description.
But can I feel we're descending too much into nihilism, and I mean,
That's just me.
I mean, I think
Wear black, always.
I think a fair amount is warranted, but I do think there are areas where there's massive progress. So just to pick an example that's salient to me, work on the ventral visual pathway, right? So I didn't talk that much about it, but that face area is part of this whole processing stream that's involved in visual object recognition. So 10 years ago, I used to teach a graduate seminar with my colleague Jim DiCarlo on object recognition, and we would sort of meet before each class, and it was like, this is just impossible, like nobody's ever gonna understand this, and we'll talk about little bits of data, and it was just unimaginable because no machine vision system was even close to being able to duplicate human visual recognition abilities, and the whole, you know, neural mess that instantiated it was just so intractable. And I wouldn't say that we now understand it, but I would say there's been massive progress, especially from Jim DiCarlo's lab. So let me just give you an example. So the convolutional neural networks that he and Danny, I mean, loads of people, but he and Danny Emmons have been doing this beautiful stuff where they show, like lots of other people, that if you take this massive network and a huge number of training examples, you can get the thing to pretty much duplicate human abilities in visual object recognition, something that Jim and I considered just not in the range of possible outcomes, just like 6-7 years ago. Wait a second.
Okay.
So that's pretty amazing, but further, the layers of that network in Jim and Dan's work, they can map quite directly onto particular stages of the primate visual system, suggesting that what the primate visual system is doing is not all that different from what the convolutional neural network is doing. So that's a case where it seemed just unimaginable not that many years ago, and now there's just a huge amount of progress. Now, it's certainly not the whole thing. One problem with the convolutional neural networks is, you know, you get it to work, and then, like, actually, how does it work? You don't really understand it in the way you'd like. But I think there are domains where, you know, major progress suddenly happens, and then the trouble is the minute it happens, we're all like, oh yeah, ho-hum, we've known that all along. Well, we really haven't, you know? So I think there is lots of progress in some domains.
I'm still astonished that it works. I was around in the 80s when this was tried and didn't work very well, and it's just amazing that it does now. But there's a further question there. Those deep convolutional neural networks are trained on a couple of million images in order to learn the difference between a dog and a cat. And human infants seem to do it a lot quicker, and probably, well, it seems unlikely that they use the same learning mechanism. So,
I agree, but you can use it for two things. One is, here's a network and it works, and maybe people have a similar network in their head. But then there's a whole separate question of how do you grow that thing? And maybe the origins might be completely different, and, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is, as Nancy said, you know, it's been almost since 2012 when they beat, you know, Hinton's group basically built these deep convolutional networks, and they beat all the benchmarks. There's been like a lot of excitement. Now, the truth is that they do also, where they fail is very telling us too. For example, people have shown that if you take these deep convolutional networks and you change just a few pixels, literally like 10 pixels in the image, then it will misclassify to something completely different with 100% confidence, and to us, this looks virtually indistinguishable. So we know that they are very, impoverished in their properties. But I think what is interesting here is not so much the particular, like these neural networks now are like the brain, but the fact that they're doing inference, statistical inference, they're built out of simple units and neurons, and they're not like built of some other sort of abstract mathematical principle. I think that is very telling. That's showing us that this is a path forward to explore more and figure out what are more simple rules, because they're not that complicated in the way they work. Even backpropagation, it's a simple rule, right? I mean, it's not the learning rule of the brain. So, is
there any evidence that it exists in the brain, or even a?
Well, I don't know. I don't think there. We know that they have a lot of things that they don't have a lot of things the brain has, like feedback. The brain has massive amount of feedback. The brain has a lot of, the brain doesn't have the particular nonlinearity they have. It tends to, there are a lot of things that, so I don't think we can say, these exist in the brain, but something similar, that it has many layers, as you go higher up, it gets more and more specialized. Then I think there's strong evidence for that. Like Nancy has shown, you get these phase regions, these things have something similar, right? I mean, they don't have phase regions, but they have phase cells or whatever. Right. So
you spoke of taking inspiration from the brain in building artificially intelligent systems. What about the inverse process of looking at AI as a way of understanding what's going on in a brain?
In my opinion, yeah, so there is a lot of work there too, and that's another very powerful way. And I think that comes in two flavors. One is to analyze the data. I mean, we use machine learning, as Nancy showed. I mean, this has been for decades, right? Like, basically it's doing statistics, but the form of statistics that is has a high-dimensional statistics with very sparse data. It's what machine learning is. So we use that to analyze our data because we can never get that much data when we are recording from thousands of neurons or hundreds of neurons, to analyze them. So that's one area. The other area, I think, that doesn't necessarily come, at least this one that I get inspiration, it comes from a more sort of principled area of machine learning, like probabilistic graphical models and sort of Bayesian theory. And there we know what would be an optimal solution to a problem. If you write it down mathematically, it's just intractable. Because we know, like the Bayesian theorem basically tells you how to solve any problem if you have a graphical model of it. It just becomes intractable when you have more than 100 variables. There's more states that you have to deal with than the number of electrons in the universe or something like that, So then you have to do approximations. And there are smart statisticians, and particularly statisticians, that over the years have come up with very smart approximations. And they all involve some local rule, like they call them message passing algorithms.
Yes.
Now, interestingly enough, these local rules, people have started linking them to these deep convolutional networks. So that's sort of how I see it. Like, machine learning can teach us both, help us to analyze the data, but also gives us inspiration or ideas. People have been trying to more mathematically solve these problems.
We're running out of time, and I want to allow for at least a few questions from other people. But before I do so, is there any parting message that any of you would like to pass along? Or did you have your say?
I would just say it's a heap of fun, right? I mean, there are a lot of problems, and many of the things you want to know, there's no obvious way to answer now, but this field is fun.
That's important.
I think it's fun, and I would say there should be optimism. I think we will understand there must be some fundamental rules that in the next few decades we'll be able to say we discovered this, and then Jeff will be happier, I think.
I mean, we will, of course, gain information. The word understanding is just such a loaded word for human beings. We have this ridiculous belief that we can understand everything. And I look at this stuff every day. I cannot understand it. I doubt you can understand it. It's just beyond me.
That's a theory of mind that you
It's
just
my
announced?
theory.
So are there questions from folks?
So this afternoon we talked a lot about the wiring of the brain. And an analogy I think about that is if you take a jig chainsaw and start slicing through a Google data center, you wouldn't learn a whole lot about how Google systems actually run. Is there work being done about understanding the software and understanding the algorithms of the brain rather than so much of the wiring of the brain?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was the way we presented stuff, but so there's two major fields in biology that, let's say, they're the parents of neuroscience, is physiology and anatomy. So physiology has been more about understanding the algorithms, and anatomy more about the hardware. And these two fields have changed names over the years and stuff like that, but there's been tremendous work. For example, we know the kind of, what is the messages what is the, let's say, the money that is used for the algorithms? And these are the spikes that were discovered, in England many decades ago. So we know what is the information how neurons try and extract information from their world, at least in the early visual system, how these receptive fields are built. So we know something very like the Hebbian stuff that you discussed. We know what is at the implementation level, and there's ideas at the theoretical level, what is the learning rules that the brain uses. Now, we don't know, we haven't figured out how to put them together to make a brain work, but there's a lot of evidence towards some of these learning rules, at least there's some evidence. But it's a very difficult problem. You're right, we don't have, let's say, an algorithm. We have pieces of the algorithm. It's like we get this code and we have a bit of pieces, but we don't, it's like a puzzle. We just have very few pieces of the puzzle. But we know there are important pieces in the puzzle, we just don't know what the puzzle is, what does it represent yet. So.
I would give a totally different answer.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's not that that's wrong. It's just there are many interpretations of many of these questions. To me, there's a longstanding field that's been interested in the algorithm level understanding of mind, and it's called cognitive science or cognitive psychology. And you use behavioral methods and look at the sequence of processing steps, and you can characterize mental representations in terms of, what information is in there, what they're invariant to. You can characterize sequences of computations. I mean, this field has been going on for decades, and it has lots of beautiful results. For example, if you look at the study of language, if you want to know, how do you understand the meaning of a sentence, right? There's a question, wouldn't that be nice to understand, right? Well, we can show you the exact brain regions that are engaged when you do that. They're easy to find with functional MRI. There they are, right? But does anybody have any idea whatsoever how you represent the meaning of a sentence in a bunch of neurons? No, there's not even a hypothesis on the table. On the other hand, cognitive psychology has been at this for a long time, and they know a great deal about the precise moment-to-moment sequence of processing steps that go on when you understand the sentence from very elegant behavioral experiments, just measuring behavior. And so at that level, I'd say we really understand more about the human mind at that, what I would call algorithm level, from behavioral work than from neuroscience.
Anyone else? No?
Is the mind the same as the brain?
I think the question was, is the mind the same as the brain?
I was on a panel on a Charlie Rose show years ago when Charlie Rose, me and a bunch of neuroscientists, Eric Kendall and others, and Charlie Rose, he was all scripted. We were going to have this whole series of questions, and then out of the blue, he looks at us and he says, "Is the mind the same as the brain?" And all of us kind of looked at each other. It's like, oh shit, who's gonna do this one? And Eric Kendall, who's fearless and really impressive, just kind of stepped right up and said, "The mind is a series of processes implemented by the brain." Well, that was pretty good with zero reaction time. Good for Eric. And then my colleague Rebecca Sachs, who was on the panel, who was, probably 28 at the time, she's a genius, immediately said very charmingly, well, that's not right, or not exactly right. The brain carries out all kinds of processes that we wouldn't consider part of the mind, like the control of digestion and all this kind of stuff that's, that the brain is important for, but that's not part of the mind. And I don't think Eric has forgiven either me or her since. Anyway.
One more question.
Hi, so my question is regarding a way of, a conceptual model basically to standardize the resolution of different imaging techniques. For example, fMRI has a different scale of resolution than brain-bow or other techniques. Is there any model that standardizes these for newer researchers or new people?
Yeah, I mean, it's a multi-scale problem in that the techniques that are very good at high resolution are terrible at larger volumes, and yet the brain seems to have no problem working across these levels without any difficulty at all. There's a lot of local processing, but axons cross over to the other hemisphere, go down into the brainstem or the spinal cord. And so you would like there to be a theory that one could take, let's say, the activity patterns one gets from fMRI and say that must mean this kind of computation must be going on at the cellular level. At the moment, I think it's still even unclear whether increased blood flow is always due to excitation or sometimes due to a lot of inhibition. I mean, it's really, you'd think this would be solved, but it's very early days even for translating the meaning of an activity signal.
I'll just add to that. In 1982, a very brilliant neuroscientist named Justine Sergent did actually a study of face perception using positron emission tomography, which is a much blurrier precursor to functional MRI. And she had kind of a little blob that responded when people looked at faces. And she, made a discussion about maybe that region was involved in or specialized for face perception. And then she said, but we're looking at metabolic activity. Maybe that's the part of the brain that's absolutely the worst at face recognition. That's why the neurons are firing so hard there. So there's a lot of ambiguity.
Well, I want to thank all of you. I second what you said, Nancy, that this is fun. At least it's been fun for me. So, thanks again.
Thank you all. Before you go, we have concluding remark by David Cox.
Okay, can you give everyone a round of applause, all the speakers? We'd also like to thank Microsoft for sponsoring this event. We give them a round of applause. And I hope we've achieved some awareness of the sort of breadth and depth and amazing sort of interactivity that's possible at this intersection. And then maybe, just maybe, as Jeff might say, we have the ridiculous idea that maybe you've understood a little bit. So thank you for coming, and have a good rest of the weekend.